With Chapter 10, we get into muscles, and muscles is really what most people think about when they think about anatomy. For the majority of the chapter, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle, and that's what you probably think about. Muscles that move your arm, like if somebody's flexing off and showing muscles, they're showing their skeletal muscles. These muscles move my body, and the way they do that is they move the bone. It's weird to think about, but in order to move you, I have to move the bones in your leg. I have to move your femur and your tibia and the small bones, and what moves bones are muscles. Muscles also help us do facial expressions. How cool is that? That everything you do differently, smiling, pouting your lips, speaking, all of that involves different muscles. Breathing, swallowing, all of this is muscles. They maintain our posture so that hopefully sit up straight. You just use skeletal muscles to change your body posture. They also stabilize our muscles, like when we're standing still. Muscles give us some protection and support. When something's happening and you tense up, you're literally using your skeletal muscles to protect your body. Interestingly, muscles help get rid of some material. When you go to the bathroom, it's sphincters, and these sphincters are actually controlled sometimes by skeletal muscle. That's why we can control when we go to the bathroom. But we'll also see that there's involuntary sphincters, which is why sometimes people get scared and other things happen, and it just happens automatically. The cool thing our muscles do is produce heat. I would be able to list the different functions of skeletal muscle. Let's keep going. We started talking about functions, like what does it do? And now we're going to switch over to characteristics. How do we describe skeletal muscle tissue? It's excitable. That means it can respond to a stimulus. It also is conductive. That means it's going to involve some kind of electrical charge. Skeletal muscle is contractile. That means it can shorten or cause movement when the parts inside the muscle slide past each other. We'll explain that as we go on. Skeletal muscle is extensible. Watch this word. Not extendable, extensible. That means it can be stretched. And skeletal muscle is elastic or shows elasticity. That means once it's stretched, it's returning to its original length. What's these two words? Extensibility is making it longer, and elasticity is returning to its original length. Gross anatomy. We can think about each muscle as an organ. Go back to chapter 1. What's an organ? A collection of different tissues. What's tissues? A collection of different cells, right? Every skeletal muscle in your body is an organ because they have lots of tissues working together. We have the skeletal muscle tissue. We have connective tissue, like maybe attaching to a bone. There's blood vessels taking blood and nutrients to the muscle, and there's nerves. So lots of different tissue type. Watch these words, and for now, I would just make flashcards, be able to define it. Inside each muscle, there's several fascicles, and a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. One muscle has many fascicles, and each fascicle has many fibers. Another term for muscle fiber is muscle cell. These are really weird. When we see them, some are going to be real long, much different than the cell shapes we saw like with epithelium. So a muscle cell is also called a muscle fiber. The next slide will help us put this together, but now just get it in your notes. Epimysium versus perimysium versus endomysium. When I'm looking at skeletal muscle, we think of it as this organ. There's connective tissue that separates it into different parts. And for now, make sure that you can match these together. Epimysium goes around the entire muscle. Epi means it's upon. So literally, epimysium is upon the muscle. If I go deeper, once I cut into it, then I could get to the perimysium. Peri means around. And it's the peri that wraps around fascicles. And then once I'm really deep, I'm endomysium. It ain't out though, it's endomysium, all the way inside, going around those individual cells or individual muscle fibers. Before we get to the terms, let's figure out here's what bone. Hopefully you said humerus, and there would be the head of the humerus, lesser and the greater tubercle of the humerus, the intertubercular groove of the humerus. So we have, anyway. And then here's a tendon attaching this muscle, right? The bone's going through here. Here's the muscle coming out of this. The tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. Going around the muscle itself is the epimysium. Epi is around the entire muscle. Perimysium. Every one of these is a fascicle. So I circled one fascicle, and perimysiums go around fascicles. I mean, we could do other ones. There's another fascicle, and there's perimysium I just circled. I'm going to switch colors. Once I go inside, I'm at the endomysium. What they're showing you is this outer coating of this fiber here would be endomysium. And if I could just get my dots right, like if I could put one dot at the ends of any one of these dots would be covering endomysium. Endomysium is the fiber. I'm telling you, you got to be able to do this both with the picture and with the notes. Epimysium. Epi means upon. It goes upon the entire muscle. Perimysium goes into the parts. Specifically, those parts were called fascicles. And inside the fascicle was the fiber, the most inside part. And so endomysium goes around fibers. Remember, now we're understanding that a muscle is an organ, and that organ has to attach to something. And so it's probably going to attach to a bone, but like I mentioned, the muscles of facial expression, things that make you smile, those actually attach to skin, or sometimes one muscle attaches to another muscle. A couple of terms to get. Most commonly, when a muscle attaches to something, there's a tendon, or maybe multiple tendons, like the tendon that attaches your bicep brachii to the bones it connects to. These tendons are dense, regular connective tissue. Remember way back I drew my zombie example, and dense regular had lots of fibers going in the same direction. And so that's a tendon. Another thing that sometimes happens is an aponeurosis. Let's do a different color. Aponeurosis is more of a blending. And so it's not regular. The fibers are a little more irregular. So the aponeurosis, they're not as common as tendons, but I'll point those out as we go through. Some other connective tissue things we're going to see. Fascia is always a type of connective tissue. And so it's going to have more of that irregular stuff. And it's right close to the muscle itself. Remember, the epimysium was kind of that outer coating of the muscle. And its next thing to the muscle would be the deep fascia. And closer to the skin would be superficial fascia. Closer to the skin is the superficial. And there's probably going to be less dense tissue there and more adipose. Remember, areolar was another name for irregular connective tissue. Each muscle has probably several different blood vessels that go to it. Definitely the larger muscles have lots of blood supply, extensive blood supply. They're very well vascularized. This is important because our muscles, when they're working, they not only need oxygen, but they need nutrients. We're going to talk so much about calcium in here, and you're going to understand calcium in a different way by the time we finish this chapter. But anything that works produced waste. So those muscles, while they're working and after they work, continuing with the metabolic process, they produce waste products, and our blood vessels carry that away. Blood vessels also are very well innervated. That means they're going to have some nerve going to it. And I just want to plant the seed now. Motor moves us. And so a motor neuron is going to go to our nerves. This is really block 5 material, but just to get our words here. And soma is the body. So somatic motor moves body. And again, neurons tells us it's the nerves. And really this is going to be more chapter 13 through 16. We'll talk much more about this. These nerves meet the muscle. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the neuromuscular junction. Those words should point you toward a nerve meeting a muscle. And a junction is where things come together. And the majority of this chapter and almost all of the next chapter is about voluntary muscles. Voluntary muscles are things we can control or at least be conscious of. Anytime you've raised your hand or done something like tie your shoes, you're using voluntary muscle. But interestingly, even things that we don't think about, like when you're walking and you're texting at the same time and you didn't realize, but you just walked 50 yards and you actually missed where you were going to turn because you were playing on your phone, voluntary muscles were in control. All right, this part gets real challenging, and just hang in there. For nothing else, get your notes and it'll make sense by the end of the chapter. Another term for a voluntary muscle cell is a muscle fiber. And these fibers have several things around them. When we talked about cells, we talked about cytoplasm. That was like the fluid, the gel-like stuff, and all the organelles that were inside the cell. In a muscle, we don't call it cytoplasm, we call it sarcoplasm. Sarcoplasm is in skeletal muscles. And all of those other organelles we talked about, like the mitochondria and the nucleus, all of that is going to be in the sarcoplasm. There's other contractile proteins. We're going to see things that contract and do work. When we're looking at skeletal muscle, we saw this in the tissue chapter. They've multi-nucleated, lots of nuclei, because these cells are going to be really, really long. We talked about blasts build things, and so myoblasts are the cells that build muscles, way back when we were developing as an embryo. Not all myoblasts fully develop. Some of them kind of stay around so that later on they form what's called satellite cells. And satellites just hang out in the area. And it's cool as later on in life, maybe you damage your muscles and these satellite cells, which is kind of like a myoblast, can repair the damage. Another structure around the muscle cells or the muscle fibers is the sarcolemma. Remember, sarco is going to point you to skeletal muscle. And this is what we were calling the cell wall or the plasma membrane when we were looking at other cells. There's lots of channels that allow stuff to go into the muscle or out of the muscle cell. There's also a full name is called transverse tubules, but commonly they're just called T-tubules. And this is so cool because transverse, like there's two parallel lines and there's two transverse lines. And so it's really cool. The T-tubules look like a T. They're because of the transverse shape to them. And again, we're going to see calcium is so important. And when these get special electrical charges, they let calcium come in so the muscle can do some work. Let's try to put this together with a picture. We started with an entire muscle. What goes around a muscle? Epimysium. Inside a muscle, there's a bunch of parts. What's each part called? A fascicle. What goes around a fascicle? Perimysium. And then every one of these little dots, but here we're just picking one just so we can zoom in on it. Every one of these would be a muscle fiber, also called a muscle cell. And this would be the endomysium. And now we're looking specifically at one of these muscle cells or one of these muscle fibers. Going around the outside of this and peeled back here so we can see inside, go around the outside of this is that sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is the cell wall or the plasma membrane. The sarcolemma is peeled off so we can see some of these deeper structures that we'll get to. Muscle fibers are the cell. And the smaller unit, these are smaller than the cell, are myofibrils. Myofibrils are the smaller portion. It goes myofibril, fiber, fascicle, muscle. These myofibrils, once we get down here, now we can see like right in here we be part of a T-tubule. There's one labeled because the muscle cell is going this way and these are going transverse to it. So here would be a T-tubule and there's another T-tubule. These T-tubules, each of them meets two things. And so there's actually three things here. And so that's what I think maybe on the next slide we'll see the triad. On the next slide we're going to zoom in to right in here. Here specifically would be that T-tubule, the part diving deep down into those myofilaments. All of these things out here are some type of ion. Maybe it's sodium or something with a little charge like potassium. And in order for this muscle to do work, some of the chemicals has to go from outside to inside. This is the detail we're going to see coming over the next several slides. But I just want to plant the seeds now. So here we're seeing some channels that are specific, ion specific, to allow potassium to go from out to in and allow sodium to go from in to out. The next several slides we're going to talk about this microscopic activity. Here's that T-tubule. Remember, T means it's transverse, going deep into it. And we're going to see that when a muscle works, oftentimes ions are either going into a cell, like this sodium here, or leaving a cell like this potassium. Sometimes it's pumped, sometimes it's voltage gated. Remember, voltage means electricity is going to drive this. We'll learn more about it. A muscle cell, also called a muscle fiber, has lots of those myofibrils. Depending on how big the cell is, depending on really the muscle, it may be thousands, but it's definitely in the hundreds. Think about a little bitty muscle that moves your eyelid. Still has hundreds of myofibrils in each of those muscle cells. Those myofibrils are surrounded by a reticulum, a sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember, that's like a cell wall. When these myofibrils are bundled together, they're going to be wrapped around in this stuff called a sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's an internal membrane. It's not the outside cell wall. It's stuff inside the cell or inside the muscle fiber. Terminal means where something ends. And so the terminal cisternae is what actually attaches to this sarcoplasmic reticulum. We'll see it on another slide here. We used this word earlier, the triad. That's where the T-tubule meets the two cisternae. Sometimes things have to be pumped because they're not going downhill. Remember that transport we talked about in the cells chapter. And so calcium has to be pumped into, it imports calcium. And we'll see that there's some hormone-like stuff that is involved to control this as well. Calcium can not only go into a muscle cell or a muscle fibril, it can leave. And it's going to have some channels that release the calcium. That calcium leaves the myofibril and goes through the fluid around it. In this slide here, we're seeing a triad. Here's the T-tubule going in, and one terminal cisternae and another terminal cisternae. So all three of these make up the triad. Here's where when electricity, our nervous system sends electricity and fires off these voltage-gated channels to allow some calcium to go in. Right now the channel is closed, but calcium is stored or used in this sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the myofibril. Other ions could be involved, like this sodium we're seeing go through this voltage-gated channel when the nervous system fires off to allow this sodium to go in. Or this voltage-gated channel when the nervous system fires off, it allows potassium to exit through this channel here. All right, complicated stuff. Here's some other big ideas. In order to move, we need contractile proteins, things that can contract. And we have two types. We're going to do some word association. Thick filaments has lots of myosin versus thin filaments has more actin. So here's my mnemonic. My oh my, you so thick, because myosin goes with thick. My oh my, you so thick. Why are you actin so thin? To help you remember, thin has actin. There's a few other proteins that are around there. Troptomyosin and troponin. We'll see those on the next slide as well. But the big one from this one, thick and thin filaments are the main contractile proteins. When we're looking here, way up here was a muscle, and the muscle had fascicles, and the fascicles had muscle cells or muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber has a myofibril. Now we're taking those myofibrils and looking at the myofilaments, the smallest part we're seeing here. And altogether it's going to look like this, but first let's break it down. We have the thick and the thin. Here's the thick filament. It's like a thick piece of cable. And each of these has a little head to it. And so all of these, we could track them down, like there's the head that goes with that. But each of these, this is what actually makes the thick part. There's a little head that sticks up. Thick has the myosin. My oh my, you're so thick. The other one, the thin filament, has the actin. The thin also has this other stuff, the troponin and troptomyosin. The troptomyosin is like a string that wraps around it. And the troponin is the little structures, the little beads that are on the string. Troponin, troptomyosin. Both of those are on the thin or actin filaments. And look at the size. The thick is about twice the size of it. Don't worry about the units right now, but this one's about 5.5. This one's 11, right? Thick is thicker. This is so important because this is what we're going to build our movement understanding on. Two myofilaments that are contractile. Thick has myosin. Thin has actin. If we look at a long myofilament, it's going to have little sections like this. When we zoom in, It really is not one solid piece. It's several pieces. And each piece could be defined as a sarcomere. A sarcomere is a segment. It's the repeating unit. And each of those little breaks I drew in would be where we find a Z-disc. So Z-disc separates sarcomeres. Z-disc separate sarcomeres. Or we could say as from one Z-disc to another disc, that would be one sarcomere. And there's the next sarcomere, and there's a previous sarcomere. These Z-discs are where the thin filaments anchor. Thick does not, but the thin filaments anchor to the Z-disc. And it depends on how these filaments are arranged. They're going to create some other segments that we'll just have to match up with definitions and pictures. Sometimes the myofilaments make an I band. Most importantly, I bands are only thin filaments, versus A bands is where the overlapping of thick and thin blend. We'll try to put this together in a picture in just a second, but two more. We also have a couple of zones. Most important about the H zone, it's thick only. Remember, the I band is thin only, the H is thick only. We also have an M line, and the M line is where the thick filaments attach. So much of this information together here. I started at looking at a muscle, and I went smaller and smaller to where I was looking at the muscle fascicle and the muscle fiber, and then all the way inside the muscle fiber are these myofilaments. Here's my thick, and here's my thin filaments. We're not going to worry, but yeah, if you're remembering, the thin had the troponin and the tryptomyosin on it. Here is one Z disc, here's another Z disc. So all of this is one sarcomere. Here's the start of the next sarcomere. Here's the start of another sarcomere. A sarcomere from one Z disc to another Z disc. The easiest is right in the middle is the M line. Here's the H zone. H was thick only. Once we start to get overlapping, now we're in the A band. Once I'm past the thick and I'm thin only, I'm in the I band. Before we get to what they're showing us here, here's a Z disc. Here's a Z disc. So that's one sarcomere. Here's that middle of it, that M line. Here's where we have some overlapping. Here's thin only. If we look now what they're showing us, if we look at it, here's the A band with thick and thin filaments. Closer toward the sarcomere is the I band where it's thin only. Closer to that midline where I'm thick only, I would be in that H zone. These are not contractile proteins, but there are some other proteins there called connectin, and connectin does what you think it does. It connects things. It helps stabilize, and it's kind of cool. It has like a coil, a spring-like protein. It acts like a spring. And then there's dystrophin, and that's another little anchor point. Don't get too lost in these, but here's where some pathology can come in. It's crazy that this little bitty protein, if I have a problem with it, I could develop muscular dystrophy. And muscular dystrophy is hereditary. It gets passed on in genes. And it's specifically dealing with this protein. Either I don't have enough of it, I have insufficient dystrophin, or what I make isn't working, it's defective. And it's that sarcolemma of these myofibrils. Remember, that's the coating kind of stuff that gets damaged. And we can't control really what goes into or out of the cell as well. And these problems are going to show up early, and unfortunately, these patients don't have a very long lifestyle. During their life, they're going to have difficulty walking. They're probably going to get progressively weaker. Atrophy means the muscle is wasting away, and they're probably going to have postural issues where they literally can't hold their body erect, especially not for a long period of time. Just like most cells, skeletal muscles also do have mitochondria, and we know that mitochondria is our power plant, going to give us energy production, especially if we're doing aerobic ATP. Remember, that means I'm being really active and I'm breathing hard. So muscles have, voluntary muscles have lots of mitochondria. And voluntary muscles have myoglobin. That's the cells that stores oxygen so that when I start to exercise, I don't have to like breathe oxygen in from the air, put it in my blood and transport it. This myoglobin stores oxygen so that I can quickly build at least a little bit of ATP when I need it. Myoglobin we're associated with oxygen. We also have glycogen glycogen, which is stored in our muscles, which is like fuel. It's like a shot of pre-workout or a shot of caffeine. Another thing our muscles have is creatine phosphate. It's right there in the muscles so that we can go through that phosphorylation and we can change that into that ADP into ATP. In other words, my muscles have lots of ways that they can produce energy. Just one little note to end this section on here. When people are cutting steak, they often think that like the red stuff that comes out of a steak, even if it's like cooked rare, is blood. And that's probably not true. What's probably coming out of most red meat when you're cutting it, especially if it's been cooked at all, is either the glycogen or some myoglobin that's being released. It has lots of oxygen in it, and that's what's going to have some iron with it, give it that red color, but it's truly not blood. It's something that muscle stored up so that when it needed to work, it had the energy. All right, let's keep going through chapter 2. I'll see you in the next section.